There is a sharp, breathless panic that traps your chest in a tight, iron vice when you lie awake at night, hyper-aware of every single thump of your heart, every tiny twitch in your muscles, and every passing, unexpected ache in your ribs. You are trapped in a grueling cycle of internal vigilance, treating the natural, rhythmic fluctuations of your physical frame as a series of catastrophic alarms that signal imminent sickness or total physical collapse. The silent bedroom around you feels heavy with apprehension, while the rough, cool texture of a linen sheets rests against your damp ankles, and the distant, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock sounds less like time passing and more like a countdown to disaster. Your skin feels highly sensitive, your throat feels dry and narrow, and you are carrying an exhausting secret dread that your physical vessel is fundamentally fragile, brittle, and poised to shatter at any moment. You are bracing your abdomen against the mattress, tracking every somatic ripple with a terrified intellect, unable to find a single pocket of safety within your own flesh. It is an incredibly lonely desolation to feel as if your own body has turned into an unpredictable enemy territory, an unstable machine that requires your constant, obsessive monitoring just to stay in one piece. Your nervous system is reacting as if every minor biological fluctuation is a crack in the foundation, demanding that you stay awake to police the pulse and analyze the breath, terrified that if you let down your guard for a single second, your entire health will give way. But your physical design is not broken because your pulse is racing in the dark tonight, and your essential substance is not failing because you are trapped in a state of somatic hyperalertness. We are not going to force your heartbeat to slow down through a battle of will, and we are not going to demand that your nervous system become perfectly silent or symmetrical before you are allowed to rest. The hot currents of your anxiety can simply be left to drop their agitation into the heavy sand, allowing your consciousness to drop like heavy metal into the unyielding floor of the casting pit. There is a strange, liberating paradox hidden directly within this painful experience of body, anxiety, and somatic fear. We tell ourselves that our health depends entirely on our constant, sterile perfection, a silent, unblinking machine that must never display a single fluctuation or a transient ache to be considered safe. We believe that if the heart changes its rhythm for a single hour, or if a muscle twitches in the dark, our entire life is about to collapse into ruin. But the deepest insights of the Zen tradition reveal that this physical body is not a fragile piece of glass that must be protected from every vibration. True stability requires us to understand that the body is an elemental assembly of earth, water, fire, and wind, a dynamic, moving field of natural phenomena that is constantly shifting and adapting. The internal movements you fear are not signs of personal decay, but the natural, fiery expansion of the elements within a heavy vessel, an ongoing process that requires space, not an anxious policeman trying to clamp down on the flow. Dear friend, right now, if you have felt this suffocating knot of somatic terror tightening around your lungs today, I want you to know that the frantic vigilance over your heart rate is over. Maybe you have felt this too, the utter exhaustion of scanning your limbs for symptoms while your mind whispers that something is deeply, permanently wrong with your health. It is an impossible, grueling labor to try to force a living, breathing field of elements to remain completely silent just to satisfy the expectations of a frightened intellect, and your nervous system is simply begging for permission to stop guarding the gate. Let the dull, gritty darkness of this evening ground your heavy bones, noticing how the simple, unpolished iron screws in the floorboards do not require you to be perfectly healthy before they agree to hold the room steady. Let your stomach soften. Let your throat open up and release the invisible grip you have been keeping on that identity of the fragile, endangered patient. The frantic medical searches have been closed. The alarming thoughts have been left unanswered. And the loud demands for a perfectly silent body have grown completely quiet for the night. We do not need to discover an immediate state of perfect physical ease before your eyes are allowed to close, and we do not need to cure the riddle of your health anxiety before you can find a deep, restorative sanctuary. The true, heavy cooling of your spirit does not happen by fixing every physical sensation in your limbs, but by dropping into the dense, dark containment of your actual, unpolished tiredness. Think of your mind tonight as a pool of molten copper that has just been poured into a deep, multi-layered clay casting mold, buried far beneath the reach of the hot sun and the noisy winds of the valley floor. You do not have to force your heartbeat to be perfectly level for the earth, and you do not have to eliminate a single muscle twitch to justify your place in the dark pit. For these next few hours, your only work is to allow the tight, defensive vibrations of your nervous system to cool within the heavy sand, letting your weight find its final, lowest level inside the earthen casting matrix, while the foundry furnace has gone dark and the heavy bellows are resting for the night. The lower industrial quarters of Kamakura do not announce their wisdom through elegant stone gardens or white silk scrolls, keeping their transformations buried beneath the heavy, ash-stained floorboards of the great casting pits. It was into this dark, cavernous landscape of ringing iron and swirling coal dust that a young temple monk named Shinji descended one humid morning, his clean linen robes tucked uncomfortably around his waist and his heart pounding with a wild, uncontrollable terror. For 3 years, Shinji had tried to sit in the silent meditation halls of the high northern monasteries, but his practice had become an agonizing internal torture chamber. The moment the room grew perfectly quiet, his attention would lock onto his chest with an obsessive, breathless vigilance, tracking the fierce thud of his pulse, panicking over every uneven breath, and misinterpreting every muscle twitch as an omen of a sudden, fatal heart failure. The monastery masters, recognizing that his intellect was completely paralyzed by this constant somatic policing, had finally packed his bowl and sent him down the mountain, instructing him to seek out an old bronzersmith who worked in the smoky dugouts near the southern marshes. He walked through the heavy, iron-scented air of the foundry district, his stomach twisting with a secret, burning shame that he was too physically fragile and broken to handle the spiritual path. He found the workshop at the bottom of a wide earthen excavation, a subterranean pit smelling of wet river sand, burning coal dust, and hot tallow. In the center of this gritty floor knelt Master Jidong, a master bronzersmith with deep, dark lines permanently etched around his eyes and heavy forearms scarred by decades of stray metal sparks. The old man was not chanting sutras or contemplating sacred texts. He was completely absorbed in packing a massive, multi-layered clay casting mold that sat in a deep pit, his thick, calloused thumbs, slamming wet river sand around the outer walls of the shell with an absolute, unhurried precision. Jaedong did not look up when the trembling monk approached the ledge, nor did he offer a polite greeting to the city traveller. He simply kept his rhythm, the rhythmic thud of his heavy fists against the damp sand, creating a low, percussive vibration that hummed through the soles of Shinji's bare feet. Shinji sat down on a pile of cold casting iron at the edge of the pit, his chest tightening with that familiar, narrow panic as the heat of the melting furnace nearby began to radiate against his skin. He watched the old smith work for an hour, his mind spinning with a desperate, hurried urge to explain his sickness, to confess that his body was an unstable, fragile machine that was constantly failing him in the dark. He looked at a massive bronze ceremonial temple bell that sat unpolished in the corner, its thick metal walls covered in rough ridges, dark patches of oxidized scale, and uneven bumps from the pour. Shinji stepped closer to the bell, his voice trembling as he cried out to the smith, asking how such a rough, flawed vessel could ever endure the strike of a heavy wooden ram without cracking into 1,000 useless fragments. He confessed his deep terror that his own chest was too weak to hold the pressure of life, believing that his racing pulse was a sign that his internal vessel was about to shatter into the dirt. Master Jaedong stopped his work slowly, his smoke-stained chin resting near his collarbones, as he reached into a leather pouch beside his anvil and pulled out a long, heavy iron wire that had been repeatedly dipped in rendered deer fat until it formed a thick, pale cylinder. This object was the tallow dip gauge, a simple, grease-covered tool used by foundry workers to trace the precise thickness of a mold's internal chamber by scraping it against the hidden earthen core. The old man did not offer a gentle philosophical lecture. He stood up on his weathered, bow-bent legs, walked over to the giant unpolished bell and struck its rim with the heavy iron end of the tallow gauge, sending an immense, vibrating boom through the damp air of the foundry floor. The sound was not a thin, sterile chime. It was a deep, earth-shattering roar that shook the soot from the roof beams, a massive wave of resonance that felt incredibly heavy, dense, and full of raw, natural power. Shinji covered his ears in sudden fright, stepping back from the vibrating metal as he pointed out a long, uneven ridge where the molten bronze had pushed hard against the damp river sand during the pour. He cried out that the wall was imperfect, arguing that if the metal had been cast in a smooth, perfectly thin sheet without those heavy, irregular bumps, the sound would be clean and free from the terrifying distortion that was currently rattling his ribcage. Master Jaedong wiped his ash-covered forehead with a stained rag, his dark eyes reflecting the dull orange glow of the charcoal furnace pit. He spoke in a low, rhythmic grunt that sounded like iron shifting on stone, telling Shinji that he completely misunderstood the nature of the bronze. He explained that if the bell were cast with perfectly thin, silent, uniform walls, the first strike of the wooden ram would shatter it like a piece of cheap glass, because it would have no density to absorb the fierce expanding fire of the blow. The old man reached out and patted the rough, irregular ridge of the bell, explaining that the vessel was strong, precisely because of its heavy, imperfect density, not despite it. The bumps and the thick patches of metal were the exact places where the bronze had found its natural weight against the unyielding river sand, creating a vessel that could hold the most violent vibrations for a century without ever losing its structural integrity. Shinji stood completely frozen on the gritty foundry floor, his breath catching in his throat as a profound wave of emotional recognition washed through his tired frame, breaking through the iron vise that had trapped his chest for months. He looked at the heavy, unpolished bell, then down at his own racing pulse beneath his ribs, feeling a sudden, quiet understanding that his internal biological movements were not a series of fatal flaws or cracks in his health. The heart's heavy thumping and the muscles' sudden twitches were just the natural, fiery resonance of the elements moving within a dense, living vessel that was fully designed to carry the pressure. He leaned his back against the solid timber support of the foundry wall, letting his shoulders drop completely for the first time since he had fled the monastery, fully anchoring his anxious mind in the slow, smoky sanctuary of the subterranean casting pit. This grounding insight from the subterranean floor of the casting pit does not demand that you turn your physical body into a frozen, unfeeling piece of marble, nor does it mean you must eliminate the natural pulsing sensations that prove you are alive. The ancient lineage of deep somatic observation simply invites us to meet our physical vulnerabilities with a far gentler form of curiosity, realizing that our profound exhaustion is not caused by the simple movements of our biology. When your heart rate shifts or your muscles encounter a sudden, transient fluttering, it is an entry into a temporary, natural cycle of elemental movement. The original physical sensation of a racing pulse or a tight chest is merely a single moment of honest, organic fluctuation, a natural wave of warmth or pressure passing through the tissues. The true heavy suffering develops in the minutes that follow, when the terrified intellect refuses to permit the sensation to move and begins a frantic internal policing action against its own living skin. We spend our precious midnight hours desperately trying to force our organs into a state of sterile, absolute silence, convinced that if we cannot maintain a perfectly uniform, unblinking rhythm, our physical vessel will suddenly shatter into pieces. We look back at the moments when our bodies felt completely unbothered, clinging to the memory of that effortless stillness with a tense, painful craving to duplicate that old comfort, completely blind to the fact that a living form must constantly shift to stay balanced. This constant internal checking behavior is where our true agony lives, an extra, self-inflicted pressure that we layer directly on top of our original somatic warmth. The initial drop in your breathing ease or the sudden spike in your pulse is just a natural weathering of the elements, a passing draft that carries no personal judgment or permanent threat to your survival. But by treating this changing landscape as a terrifying catastrophe, your mind transforms a simple period of fluid physical adaptation into a grueling daily interrogation, endlessly measuring the thickness of the vessel wall with the sharp defensive tool of your worry. This ancient teaching reminds us that the somatic self is an unceasing, fluid movement of heat and solidity, an organic convergence where nothing is permitted to remain completely static forever. Your blood flow, your nerve endings, and your internal systems have a natural rising and a natural falling, moving through their own structural adaptations, just like the liquid copper, finding its contour against the damp river sand. When you try to clamp down on your body, to force it into a permanent state of high perfection, you are resisting the very fluid dynamics that keep your heart beating and your blood moving through your limbs. You lock your ribs, tighten your throat, and force your mind to stay awake through the dark, frantically demanding that a heavy, resonant bell behave like a silent void. This desperate control is what hollows out your spirit, leaving your internal landscape feeling bruised and brittle, because you are fighting against the natural density of your own growth. An authentic emotional freedom begins when you stop viewing your physical sensations as a sign of imminent destruction and start seeing them as the natural, fiery resonance of a heavy vessel that is fully designed to carry the vibration. You do not need to experience a sudden state of perfect, weightless comfort tonight, and you do not need to solve the riddle of your somatic anxiety before your muscles are allowed to sink into the bed. Think of your fundamental presence right now as that broad, patient-casting floor, a thick layer of damp river sand that remains completely steady and unbothered, whether it holds a roaring furnace or a quiet, cooling mold full of dense bronze. The medical definitions, the frightening scenarios of your past, and the high expectations of perfect fitness are just passing shadows that drift across the rafters, elements that have no power to destroy your underlying structural integrity. When the heat sinks and the air cools, the ground beneath you does not lose its stability, and your essential life force does not collapse simply because you have allowed the metal to find its lowest level. When we begin to treat our moments of physical tension with this soft, unhurried awareness, our relationship with our own somatic fear undergoes a profound, beautiful shift in gravity. We stop treating our racing heart as a shameful secret that must be managed with frantic checking behaviors, and we begin to welcome the internal vibration as a necessary protective resonance. We realize that our insistence on analyzing every minor twitch is just a misguided habit of a frightened mind, an anxious attempt to find security by forcing a changing, living form to remain completely frozen before its time. The true healing takes hold when we turn our gaze away from the medical narratives and drop our entire weight directly into the immediate, felt density of our own unvarnished tiredness. We notice the cool, spacious channels within our own breathing, the steady hold of gravity through our hips. That this unyielding support is the only authority that matters tonight. Allowing your internal rhythm to settle into its heavy, natural density in this deep, emotional sense is not an act of surrender to sickness, but a gentle permission for the fierce heat of your vigilance to leave your bones without your hands trying to catch it. You do not need to repair your physical vessel or justify your current lack of perfect ease before your body is permitted to settle into the cool stillness of this evening. The busy world may have trained you to believe that your survival is a fragile thing that must be constantly policed through your own anxious thoughts, but you do not have to continue that violence against yourself by denying your nervous system the right to be quiet tonight. Your body has carried the weight of that roaring bonfire for far too long, and the dark, sand-filled pit of this bedroom is fully prepared to take the load from your shoulders. As you lie here in the gathering quiet, allow yourself to witness the remarkable stability of a single, unforced breath moving through your center. Each inhalation is a fresh, clean arrival of space, a quiet energy that has absolutely no memory of the symptoms you think you discovered or the panics you are trying to prevent. Each exhalation is a natural dropping of internal defense, a soft melting of the heavy wood that requires no intellectual arguments and no strategic planning. The future is an unmapped landscape that cannot demand anything from you while you remain anchored in the vivid, quiet density of this passing minute. By leaning your entire frame into the unyielding baseline of your bed, you are choosing to step out of the frantic forge of your perfectionism and into the ancient, secure sanctuary of the dark foundry pit, where the noise of the world can no longer diminish the deep, silent sweetness of your peace. If it feels right, you might let your attention slide down into the natural, unhurried pace of your breathing. At this very moment, there is no need to stretch your chest into an artificial pattern or to force your ribs to match a rhythm that feels heavy or rigid. Simply watch the cool, subtle texture of the air as it passes through your nostrils, and the soft, organic dropping of your center as your abdomen releases its remaining pressure. Perhaps you can notice the tiny, unmoving pocket of stillness that opens up between the very end of your exhalation and the fresh arrival of your next inhalation. It is an interval where absolutely nothing is being built, a small, dark sanctuary of complete rest where your spirit requires no credentials to exist. Let each release of your air be an invitation for your shoulder blades to settle deeper into the mattress, as if you were allowing your physical spine to find its natural alignment with the gravity of the floor below. As you rest here in the stillness of your room, you might become curious about the exact physical shape that this fear of illness has taken inside your body. There is no need to challenge it or try to push it out of your space, as even noticing its current footprint with a soft, non-judgmental presence is entirely enough. Perhaps you feel a cold, hollow knot behind your collarbones, or a rigid clamping across your jaw, or a heavy, restricting ache around the back of your neck, where you carry your heavy, defensive persona. If a sharp thought about your physical safety or an old memory of a sudden bodily panic drifts into your mind, try to watch it without stepping into the narrative itself, naming the emotional pattern quietly as a temporary movement in your inner world. You might say to yourself, "Oh, here is the heavy dampness of vigilance trying to force a spark," or "Here is the cold ash of judgment trying to build a wall in the dark." By simply giving a name to the pattern, you separate your living presence from the artificial armor that is trying to consume your peace. Now, if it feels right, you can bring a gentle mental picture into your internal space, imagining yourself standing on that broad, quiet, earthen floor of the Kamakura foundry pit under the grey, cooling sky. The deep, rich scent of hot tallow and burning charcoal fills the damp air, and the distant, rhythmic sigh of the wind through the high roof beams echoes through the clearing, anchoring the profound silence of the workspace. In your hands, you are holding that single, grease-covered tallow dip gauge, its rough, unpolished metal, feeling cool and solid against your palms. There is no urgency on this floor, and no one is evaluating how beautifully you have performed your duties in the lower valley. You are simply holding the cylinder of rendered fat, letting your feet sink slightly into the wet river sand of the foundry floor, fully protected by the immense dome of the kiln that rises beside you. Slowly, without any forced effort, you can visualize yourself placing your worries, your fear of inadequacy, and your panic over a fragile physical future directly into the small, glowing intake hole of the clay casting mold. You are letting the heavy, waterlogged timber of your daily anxiety slide out of your chest and into the dark, heated chamber, allowing the earth mound to hold the burden that has been straining your nerves. As you release the load, watch how the internal image begins to change, moving away from the red, spitting glare of the fire and focusing entirely on the wet mud plug as you press it deep into the opening. The bright light and the crackling noise dissolve completely into a dark, low oxygen containment, offering a cool, unyielding shelter where the green wood can age in peace. The mountain does not ask the oak to justify its moisture, and it does not demand that the clay dome be polished to validate the charcoal. You can return your attention to the physical reality of your immediate room whenever you are ready, bringing your awareness back to the soft rise and fall of your stomach beneath the heavy wool. The foundry image can dissolve into the background of your consciousness, but the feeling of being held by an unshakable, dark foundation remains completely available to your body tonight. There is absolutely nothing that needs to be constructed or resolved before your eyes can close for the evening. You are not required to mend your reputation tonight, and you do not need to prove your legitimacy in your thoughts before the morning arrives. You are simply allowing the heavy sap of your daily defenses to soften and bake away, trusting that the ancient, unmoving clay of this bed will continue to support your weight while you sleep. 2 full moons had traveled across the jagged coastal bluffs of the southern shore since Shinji had first traded his silk monastery vestments for the heavy canvas apron of the lower casting pits. He had slowly adapted his slender frame to the exhausting, dusty labor of shoveling gritty river sand and carrying heavy iron bars, yet a sharp, agonizing hypervigilance still lingered deep behind his ribs like an unhealed fracture. One chilling evening, as a freezing autumn rain turned the excavated courtyard into a slick pool of grey mud, a senior messenger from his former monastery descended into the pit, bringing a formal scroll that made Shinji's breath catch in instant panic. The head abbot had fallen gravely ill with a wasting condition, and the temple council demanded that Shinji return immediately to assist with the midnight prayer vigils, declaring that his fragile health was no longer a valid excuse to avoid his sacred spiritual duties. When Shinji read the black ink characters, a sudden, violent wave of somatic terror rushed through his chest, a hot, suffocating pressure that felt like an open furnace, consuming his throat. His immediate instinct was to pack his traveling bowl and run deeper into the remote mountain wilderness, to hide from the heavy responsibilities of the world before his racing pulse could completely overwhelm his physical sanity. He felt an overwhelming, frantic urge to stay awake through the night, obsessively pressing his fingers against the hollow of his neck to track the frantic thumping of his blood, treating his belief that he was on the verge of an imminent physical collapse as an unshakable, absolute truth. He wanted to use his terror as an excuse to avoid the journey, entirely paralyzed by the conviction that his fragile vessel could not endure a single mile of walking in the damp cold without his heart giving way. Master, Jidong observed his shaking hands from the edge of the furnace pit, his wide, smoke-blackened thumbs resting on the leather handle of the great air bellows. Without offering a single word of philosophical comfort, the old smith handed Shinji a solid block of raw, yellow beeswax, a dense, heavy chunk known as the wax ingress plug, which was used to seal the lower pouring vents of a massive, multi-layered clay casting mold. Jidong grunted in the dark, telling Shinji that the core mold had been heating over the charcoal furnace for 12 hours, and it was now Shinji's sole responsibility to watch the lower channels while the old man slept in the rear tool room. The old man warned him that when the inner matrix began to melt, the empty space inside the clay would create a strange, hollow whistling sound, a natural movement that must be met with absolute stillness if the bronze was to find its true weight. The subterranean workspace was completely swallowed by the wet dark, the freezing wind carrying the sharp, bitter scent of burning coal and hot tallow. As Shinji sat down on a low cedar block before the glowing vent, his mind was spinning with the terrifying details of the abbot's illness and his own somatic dread, making his fingers tremble violently. As he looked at the bright orange light flickering inside the earthen shell, he felt an intense, paralyzing disgust at his own physical sensitivity, believing that the loud, whistling sound inside the mold was a sign of a catastrophic internal structural collapse. Mirroring the broken machine he believed was hidden inside his own ribs. He reached for his pulse over and over, his chest tightening so severely that he could barely draw a full breath, his intellect screaming that he was currently suffocating in the smoky air of the pit. As the middle of the night approached, the thick beeswax matrix inside the heated clay mold began to liquefy, pouring out through the lower escape holes in a steady, golden stream of hot grease. The internal whistling grew incredibly loud, a hollow, echoing hiss that rattled the loose iron sheets against the anvil, making the entire structure sound as if it were about to implode under the intense heat of the coals. In a sea of panic to save the vessel from what he thought was total destruction, Shinji grabbed a heavy leather bucket of cold river water and prepared to throw it directly onto the glowing clay, desperate to cool the matrix down and stop the terrifying empty sound before the walls shattered. Just as he lifted the water, Master Jidong appeared from the shadows of the tool room, his rough, scarred hand gently but firmly catching Shinji's wrist, stopping the bucket in mid-air. Shinji cried out in pure frustration, his voice cracking as he warned the old smith that the core was empty, yelling that the entire structure was losing its internal support and collapsing into a useless hollow. He stood in the freezing rain, his old habit of treating his panicking thoughts as absolute truth, screaming that the empty space inside the vessel was a fatal disaster that would destroy their labor. Master Jidong did not raise his voice. He took the heavy leather bucket away from Shinji's trembling fingers, reached into the leather pouch and handed the long, grease-covered tallow dip gauge directly to the young monk. He looked into Shinji's frantic eyes and told him to stop trying to protect the mold from its own natural empty space, instructing him to take a slow, deliberate breath before he allowed his fear to ruin the pour. Shinji hesitated, his chest heaving as the cold rain hit his bare neck, his mind screaming that he was currently experiencing a medical emergency that required his immediate flight. But as he looked at the old smith's calm, unmoving posture, he chose to make one small, profound shift in his behavior, stopping his hand from reaching for his neck and choosing to sit directly with the massive uncertainty of the dark. He closed his eyes to the flickering glare, took a long, unhurried breath through his nose, and simply allowed the hollow whistling sound of the mold to echo through the clear. Without trying to fix it, he realized that the melting of the wax matrix was not a sign of destruction, but the exact, necessary clearing of the channel, a beautiful process that was making room for the heavy bronze to enter and take its permanent, secure form. With a soft, compassionate action, Shinji bent down in the mud, took the raw yellow beeswax plug, and firmly pressed it into the lower vent hole, sealing the empty chamber so the molten metal could be poured from the top without leaking into the dirt. He did not check his pulse again for the rest of the night. He simply sat on his cedar block in the absolute blackness, listening to the low, muffled gurgle of the liquid copper filling the core, deliberately choosing not to obey the frantic thoughts that told him his body was on the verge of collapse. In the morning, when they dug the cooled mold out of the damp river sand and broke away the clay shell, Shinji looked down and let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief. The vessel was completely whole, a dense, heavy bronze casting that was entirely solid, resting heavily in the dirt without a single crack or blemish on its rough skin. Shinji laid his palms against the warm, dark metal, a profound, quiet realization settling into his chest like a solid iron anchor. He understood that his moments of intense somatic anxiety and the sudden, empty drops in his physical energy were not fatal. Defects that meant his health was permanently failing. The emptiness was merely the clearing of the old, rigid matrix of control, a natural shedding of his intellectual armor, so his spirit could learn to rest heavily in its elemental truth. 2 days later, when he packed his bowl to return to the northern monastery, he did not walk with a frantic stride, and he did not carry a bottle of medicine to protect his pulse. He walked out of the foundry district with a slow, deliberate cadence, his body completely anchored in a subtle, transformed relationship with suffering that allowed him to sit comfortably with the uncertainty of his own physical skin. The deep psychological integration that occurs when we stop poking at our own raw flesh reveals the hidden, intricate machinery of our persistent spiritual fatigue. When we look closely at why the terror of a physical malfunction continues to drain our vital energy night after night, we discover that our exhaustion does not come from our actual biological limitations. The true source of our depletion is the constant, subconscious effort to maintain a perfectly silent, artificial body to show to the world, treating our ordinary biological sensations as a fatal crime that must be hidden at all costs. We carry an internal blueprint of a flawless, unmoving machine, an impeccable physiological vessel that never flutters and never aches, and we measure our raw, authentic humanity against that phantom design every single evening. This constant comparison creates a state of internal shaming, where we try to fix our sensitive nervous systems by scourging ourselves with medical analysis, convinced that if we just monitor ourselves harder, the uneven rhythms will finally dissolve. This desperate need for a perfect physiological guarantee keeps our nervous system locked in a state of high vigilance, forcing us to view our own skin as a dangerous perimeter where an attack is about to happen. In the quiet, unadorned language of Buddhist wisdom, we mistake the temporary, moving currents of our physical sensations for a permanent verdict on our survival, weaving our self-worth so tightly into our heart rate that we feel utterly erased when a single thump is too loud in the dark. When that internal stability wavers, the mind panics at the presence of uncertainty, viewing the ordinary movements of the blood as a hostile invasion rather than a wide canyon of biological life. To cope with this fear, we spend our nights replaying our past panic attacks under a harsh torch, or we burn our energy rehearsing emergency scenarios for future illnesses that may never arrive. We turn our original sensitivity into a hard, protective identity of a sickly, endangered patient, mistakenly believing that if we remain defensive, we can shield ourselves from the pain of decay. Consider the immense difference between the raw, inevitable friction that our physical biology brings and the heavy, secondary load we stack on top of it through our own resistance. When a sudden thumping or a moment of ordinary somatic numbness touches your chest, it is like a cloud of wild mountain hornets swarming around an unrefined cleft in the limestone, a natural occurrence that brings a sudden hum of tension to the silent air. This initial hum is the inevitable pain of living in a changing, organic body made of earth and fire, an unchangeable event that carries no personal malice toward your character. The suffering begins when you refuse to let the hornets move in the dark, standing before the rock wall with a bright torch and frantically trying to pick apart the sticky, chaotic honeycomb fragments with your bare fingers because you believe the hive must look completely clean to be valid. Your resistance does not dissolve the rough fragments. It only heats the wax, melting the impurities deeper into the core and burning your own palms in a self-inflicted battle against the natural texture of the mountain. True inner peace does not require you to go back in time and prevent yourself from ever feeling an uneven heartbeat, nor does it mean you must magically transform your ordinary human pulse into a completely static masterpiece of steel. Freedom emerges when you fundamentally alter your relationship with the raw, unpolished wax of your current physical experience, choosing to stop treating your self-doubt and body twitches as an absolute truth about your legitimacy. It is the realization that your internal baseline is not built out of the decorated boxes of your physical achievements or flawless health metrics, but out of the vast, unyielding limestone canyon that contains both the dark fissure and the sweet amber honey. You can live a deeply centered, magnificent life with an uneven, unmapped biological future, just as a wild hive can produce the sweetest clover extract for centuries while remaining completely hidden in the rough, jagged shadows of the deep rock cleft. When we stop demanding that our bodies be perfectly symmetrical, we free our organs from the grueling role of the constant structural guardian. We no longer need to spend our precious evening hours checking the alignment of our past heartbeats, and we can abandon the habit of treating every anxious sensation as an absolute truth about our survival. This release is an act of profound compassion toward your own physical frame, a recognition that your breath, your heart rate, and your deep sleep are far too vital to be sacrificed for the illusion of total control. You are choosing to value the real comfort of your current muscles over the impossible task of forcing a shifting world to remain completely still. As you lie here in the dark, let yourself notice how much muscular effort it actually takes to maintain your internal resistance, the subtle, chronic tension required to keep your body braced against the blank spaces of your life. You can think of your awareness right now as that heavy, primitive timber A-frame, resting firmly on the solid floor of your room, its lead weight hanging completely straight and true down the center line. The thoughts of your lost stability and your changing health may still drift through your mind, like loose flakes of shale, sliding down a distant slope. But there is no need to jump into the dark to catch them or hold them up. Let them slide past, observing how they naturally find their own level at the bottom when you refuse to wrestle with their shapes. You are simply the steady frame that witnesses the landscape shift, a presence that remains fundamentally secure, unshakable, and deeply grounded in the quiet weight of this passing night. When tomorrow morning arrives, the frantic pace of your modern existence will offer 100 small invitations to step back into the burning, destructive glare of your old reactivity. You might find yourself staring at your flat phone screen, waiting for a single text message to arrive, checking your device every few minutes for a fleeting spark of digital reassurance that never seems to land. It is in those small, agonizing intervals that the cold, leaden numbness can easily creep back into your core, tempting you to believe that your worth is completely dependent on someone else's immediate attention. You might sit in your office chair or stand in a crowded line, silently replaying an old conversational mistake, or comparing your personal journey to the bright, glossy timelines of people who seem to be moving light years ahead of you. It is easy to look at those curated glass screens and conclude that your life is a flat, uninspired failure, feeling the bitter sting of inadequacy while putting on a polite smile to pretend you are perfectly fine. You might spend your entire afternoon carrying a heavy, waterlogged fatigue deep inside your belly, smiling warmly for coworkers, while feeling completely drained and empty behind your ribs. When the evening finally arrives, and you try to sit down to rest, a sharp, whispering guilt might instantly take hold of your mind, telling you that you have not earned this pause because your checklist is still unfinished. We have been trained to believe that we must maintain a roaring, public bonfire of constant productivity, treating a natural season of internal dryness as a shameful secret that must be violently overcome with a forced explosion of willpower. We become like a desperate artisan who keeps trying to strike a quartz flint over a damp branch in the middle of a torrential downpour, completely exhausting our nervous systems in a frantic attempt to produce light for a world that does not care about our depletion. But the true integration of this casting practice does not require you to drop your modern tools or flee into a permanent mountain retreat. The most profound healing happens in the unrecorded, split-second intervals of your ordinary routine, in those precise moments where you choose to observe an anxious thought rather than obey its frantic command. Tomorrow, when that old impulse to over-explain yourself or defend your path surfaces during a difficult conversation, you can choose to take one slow, deliberate breath before a single word escapes your lips. That brief, quiet hesitation is your internal clay vent plug, a conscious closing of the air intake that chokes out the volatile draft of your immediate panic, saving your precious spirit from burning itself to ash in a useless show of force. You can care deeply about your career, your relationships, and your daily responsibilities without gripping them so tightly that they choke the natural circulation in your hands. It is entirely possible to walk through your modern duties with a soft, porous attention, understanding that a critical email or an unreturned message is merely a passing shadow across the terrace, not a structural threat to your underlying value. You do not have to perform perfectly tomorrow to deserve your place on this earth, and you do not need to cure your burnout before you are permitted to surrender to the dark. The mold pit does not demand that the raw material change its internal nature before it agrees to shield it from the winter frost, as it simply encloses its heavy mass within its thick clay walls, offering a low oxygen sanctuary where the curing can happen on its own organic timeline. When you feel the familiar tightness of self-judgment or the fear of the future creeping back into your chest during a busy day, you might try a very small, invisible practice right where you stand. You can gently drop your gaze. For a second, notice the solid contact between your soles and the floor, and imagine that you are standing on that dark, smoky floor of the Kamakura, casting pit under the grey sky. Let the rich, damp aroma of wet river, sand and hot fill your imagination, grounding your awareness, grounding the raw reality of the immediate minute. You are simply a living person, breathing in a modern room, entirely separate from the frantic, conceptual stories that your intellect is spinning about your progress. Tonight, as the final hours of the evening wrap your bedroom in complete, unmoving stillness, you are being offered a total, unconditional discharge from the heavy labor of your life. There are no messages that must be passed before dawn, no historical injustices that can be resolved by another hour of tossing and turning, and no future scenarios that can be managed by your fatigue. The world can spin on its axis without your constant vigilance for these next few hours, and your only true responsibility is to yield to the immense, welcoming gravity of your bed. Let the day unspool from your mind like a heavy ribbon of dark cloth, dropping its faded patterns into the cool soil and allowing your spirit to dissolve into the clean, transparent quiet that remains when the tools are finally put away. The dug-out earthen floors of the Kamakura foundry have surrendered completely to the immense weight of the midnight hour. Down in the deep casting pit, the thick walls of the mold are holding the silent cooling of the heavy bronze. The roaring blasts of the bellows have ceased entirely. The sharp scent of hot tallow and burning coal dust has softened into the dampness of the evening. Not a single iron tool shifts on the wood benches. The entire workshop stands as a silent sanctuary against the cold coastal wind. The frantic melting is finished. The tallow dip gauge has been laid down on the gritty earth. The foundry has sealed its gates for the night. Thus, a soothing, immense density is beginning to flow through the entire length of your physical body. It is anchoring your limbs deeply into the soft support of your bed. Your shoulder blades are widening fully against the fabric. They are releasing the chronic, burning vigilance that you carried behind your ribs throughout the anxious hours of the afternoon. The tight, protective armor of your somatic policing is gently softening. It is melting away like wet river mud under the cooling influence of the dark. There is no longer any need to keep your abdomen tightly braced. Your forehead does not need to strain in a state of hyperalertness. No one is scanning your biological rhythms in this silent room. Your hands have grown completely limp and motionless on the sheets. Their fingers are relaxing fully as they drop the invisible tools of your constant monitoring. The bed beneath you is as secure as the thick sand floor of the casting pit. It is fully prepared to hold your entire weight without you needing to assist it. Your breathing has settled into a slow, rhythmic, fluid motion. It requires absolutely no conscious direction or effort from your mind. Each inhalation behaves like a cool current moving into the porous cells of your chest. It creates an expansive inner room where your spirit can simply exist without a medical narrative. Each exhalation is a passive, heavy descent into the deep gravity of the room. It is a total surrender of your frame to the welcoming dark. You can think of your awareness right now as that dense, bronze cooling within the dark containment of the earth floor. The solid metal does not panic about its internal fluctuations. It does not try to analyze its own rough edges under a harsh light. It simply allows its own natural weight to settle into the clean, quiet bed of damp river. Sand, it lets the heat clear completely from its center. You are being granted a complete, unconditional release from the grueling obligation to police your own health tonight. The inner alarms have been disabled. The frantic digital searches for symptoms have been closed. The busy marketplace of human evaluation is entirely silent. There are no muscle twitches that need to be passed before dawn. There are no historical panics that can be resolved by another hour of tossing and turning. No future illnesses can be prevented by your fatigue. The world can spin on its axis without your constant vigilance for these next few hours. Your only true responsibility is to yield to the immense gravity of your bed. Let the day unspool from your mind like a heavy ribbon of dark cloth. Drop its alarming patterns into the cool soil. Allow your spirit to dissolve into the clean quiet that remains when the furnace goes cold. Let your consciousness dissolve into the deep, dark vault of the original mind. That boundless space lived long before you ever built a frightened story about your body. In this silent sanctuary, you are completely hidden from the judgments of your own intellect. Your essential substance remains entirely whole. It is untouched by the variations you track so desperately. The details of your biological worries are turning into a soft blur. They are like the distant murmur of an underground spring, shifting beneath 3 layers of solid stone. You are stepping completely off the high tightrope of your physical performance. You are allowing your spirit to return home to the unadorned baseline of the earth. Slide down into the dreamless golden depths of this endless night. There is nothing left to filter. There is nothing left to defend. There is nothing left to do but yield to the immense, healing current of your own deep rest. As you drift further into the dark, let the smooth properties of the clay chamber wrap around your awareness. Your sinuses and the back of your throat are softening. The deep hollows behind your eyes are becoming like the empty cells of the mold that after the wax has poured out. Thick stillness pooling in these internal spaces. It is a viscous weight of presence that slows down the frequency of your thoughts. It quiets your mind until your ideas become entirely static. You are no longer drifting through the turbulent air of the valley. You are no longer trying to force your life into a rigid, artificial mold. You are simply the ancient bedrock itself. You contain the heat. You hold the dark. You remain completely unshakable while the world turns above you. The wax-sealed ingress plug rests quietly in the lower channel. It is completely dark and completely still. The tallow gauge has done its work. The metal has found its lowest level. The casting is completely full of solid, cooling bronze. You do not have to earn this peace. You do not have to achieve a state of flawless health before you are allowed to disappear into the shadow of the foundry floor. The darkness is a vast, welcoming home that already knows the true measure of your worth. It requires no apologies to grant you shelter. Let yourself sink even deeper into the heavy blankets. Let go of the very last thread of your vigilance. Allow your spirit to float away on the slow, heavy river of a dreamless sleep. When the last vibration of the great bell has dissolved into the damp sand, what remains of the fear that tried to hold the metal still? The fear itself becomes nothing more than a faint, forgotten whisper of steam that rises from the damp river sand, a transient vapor that touches the cool air for a single second before vanishing entirely into the immense, dark architecture of the foundry roof beams. It leaves behind no stain on the heavy bronze casting, and it carves no permanent fissure into the thick, unyielding clay floor that has accepted your total physical presence with such absolute unconditional stability. You are no longer required to carry the exhausting weight of that old somatic record, and you do not have to keep a midnight tally of how many times your heart rate altered during the stressful hours of the previous season. The great iron tongs have been hung back on their wall pegs. The massive leather bellows have dropped their heavy wooden handles toward the dirt, and the entire subterranean workspace has aligned itself with a profound, cooling stillness that requires no further adjustments from your mind. Your spirit is being invited to sink completely beneath the level of your active, analytical thinking, passing through the gritty layers of the workshop floor and into the deep, prehistoric silence of the earth that lives far below the reach of human panic. There is a beautiful, liberating rest that takes hold of your bones when you finally permit your physical form to be exactly as it is in this immediate, unpolished minute for weeks and months. Your sensitive mind has been acting like an anxious foundry apprentice who stays awake through the bitter winter freeze, frantically trying to catch every stray spark with his bare palms, because he believes a single glowing ash will set the whole valley on fire. You have strained every muscle in your neck and locked your jaw against the pillow, obsessively monitoring the internal furnace of your chest, terrified that if your attention wavers for a single heartbeat, your entire health will collapse into irreversible ruin. But the deep, elemental wisdom of this path reminds you that the massive clay matrix does not depend on your hypervigilance to hold its shape in the dark. The river sand remains perfectly firm, the heavy iron remains completely secure, and the natural physics of the cooling bronze will perform their silent work tonight without you needing to monitor a single somatic fluctuation. Let the mattress receive the absolute, unvarnished mass of your thighs, your hips, and your shoulders, noticing how the bed never hesitates to support your frame, regardless of how unevenly your pulse may be beating. You can let go of the secret, burning shame that you carried through the busy streets of the town, the painful belief that you are somehow more fragile, more broken, or more structurally flawed than the people who walk past you with confident strides. Their vessels are made of the very same temporary elements of earth, water, fire, and wind that move through your own chest, subject to the same natural laws of change, expansion, and sudden, transient weathering. Your sensitivity is not a fatal defect that makes you unfit for this life. It is simply the raw, unrefined resonance of a heavy, deep-walled bell that feels the wind more vividly than a block of cheap, inert stone. You do not have to silence the vibration to be safe, and you do not have to polish away the rough ridges of your current anxiety to be worthy of a deep restorative shelter in the dark. Perhaps you can hear the faint, imaginary sound of a cold autumn rain falling on the heavy tiled roof far above the foundry floor, each drop sliding harmlessly down the dark clay grooves before sinking silently into the soft marshes outside the walls. The building does not struggle to keep the moisture from moving across its outer tiles, and it does not demand that the sky turn perfectly clear before it allows its massive timber supports to settle into their structural slots. It simply trusts its own heavy density to endure the weather while the night deepens. Let your remaining thoughts mimic that slow, unresisting compliance, becoming less sharp and more spaced out with every quiet breath that exits your lips. The medical vocabulary that frightened you, the past moments of breathless panic in the crowded rooms, and the calendar dates that cause your chest to constrict are all losing their hard perimeters, turning into distant, indistinct shapes. It's like the sound of a small stream moving through a deep gorge 3 ridges away. You are entering the protective custody of the deep subterranean dark, the sacred space where the mind stops striving for form and simply rests in its own immense, unproduced mass. In this territory of complete surrender, you are entirely hidden from the evaluations of the crowd, and you are completely safe from the frantic, demanding timelines of your old perfectionism, the person who scrambled to hide their physical vulnerability, the person who searched the dark for symptoms, and the person who wore a false mask of total competence to appease. The expectations of others are all being laid down like worn, heavy canvas aprons on a low bench by the foundry threshold. Tonight, you are simply a slow, steady pulse of breathing life, a heavy physical presence resting under a thick blanket, completely separate from the concepts of sickness and health. Allow your consciousness to sink even further down, passing beneath the damp sand of the pit, beneath the deep roots of the coastal trees, and into the dark, silent core of the bedrock itself. The wind will continue to howl across the high bluffs. The freezing rain will continue to silver the stones of the courtyard, and the quiet gravity of the earth will keep holding your spirit until the morning light finds you, completely grounded, unburdened, and renewed. You have watched the furnace for far too long. You have checked the internal channels 1,000 times in the storm, and the night has finally entered a decree of absolute, unshakable quiet. Rest within the unyielding depth of this immediate, slow minute, where there is nothing left to construct, nothing left to justify, and nothing left to hold up through the force of your own will. The metal has met the earth, the sand has found its absolute center, and the darkness is a vast, welcoming home that knows exactly how to cradle your form without asking for a single explanation of how your day fell, short of perfection. Drop the iron wire. Let the mountain carry the final remnants of your structural fatigue and drift away into the dreamless golden sanctuary of this endless night. The endless night does not demand that you find a cure for your anxiety before you are permitted to let your skull sink deep into the grain of your pillow. It simply opens its great, silent reservoir to receive the full measure of your structural exhaustion, providing a deep, cool basin where the sharp, broken shapes of your day can lose their rigid perimeters. As you drift past the boundary of ordinary, vigilant thinking, you might notice that the mind no longer feels like a narrow, drafty room filled with the echo of an unexpected ruin. Instead, it begins to feel like the entire mountain valley itself, after the workers have dropped their iron tools and gone to bed. When the small charcoal pit in the workshop has died down to a faint silver dust, and the only remaining movement is the slow, heavy settling of the white fog between the cedar trunks. You are expanding into that quiet, dark territory, becoming the unmoving landscape that watches the weather pass, rather than the individual trying to hold the clouds in place with their bare hands. There is a profound, liberating truth in letting yourself be completely helpless against the pull of gravity. When we try to fix our fractured lives through the sheer force of our midnight overthinking, we are acting like an artisan who tries to stack an intricate, massive, retaining wall while his fingers are shivering from a bitter mountain wind. The more he forces the stones to move, the more friction he creates against the clay, scraping his own skin and setting the foundation on an unstable tilt that will only lean further in the morning. The highest wisdom of this Zen path is to recognize when the time for masonry has ended, and to have the immense courage to leave the collapsed slope exactly as it is. The wall does not need to be completed before you are allowed to rest, and the loose shale does not need to be cleared away to earn your right to a quiet chest. You can leave the unfinished structure in the protective custody of the dark, trusting that the stillness of these empty hours will do more to restore the integrity of your spirit than another night of frantic mending. As the heavy blankets press down against your limbs, let your awareness slide beneath the very sound of my words, moving into the deep, unmeasured pauses that live between the sentences. In those quiet intervals, there is no history, there is no bankruptcy of form, and there is no expectation for you to become anything other than what you are in this immediate, slow breath. You can feel the cool air settling into the deepest corners of your lungs, a slow, gentle expansion that requires absolutely no justification or social title to exist. The air comes to you as a completely free gift from the room, an unconditional reassurance that your body is permitted to live, to feel, and to heal on its own organic timeline, entirely independent of what was dismantled or lost in the world outside your door. Let the physical weight of your skull sink deeply into the very center of your bed, letting go of the subtle, chronic bracing that lives just behind the ears and along the base of the neck. This is where we often store the heavy iron clamps of our control, the unconscious muscular tension we use to hold ourselves together when we feel structurally upended or cast aside by a changing world. You do not need to hold yourself together tonight. The floor beneath you is anchored into the massive stone foundations of the earth. The walls of this house are secure, and the entire night is an unmoving cradle that can carry your fatigue without a single tremor. You can let the muscles of your neck go completely loose, allowing your head to feel as heavy and inert as a smooth river stone that has been polished by 10,000 winters of clean, passing water. There are no more letters to read, no more defenses to construct, and no more trials to conduct in the silent theater of your mind. The circumstances that upended you are simply parts of a changing world moving through the fog of their own nature, and their movements cannot diminish the clear, luminous quality of the awareness that is listening to this rhythm right now. You are stepping completely off the wheel of resistance, refusing to carry the secondary weight of judgment into the sanctuary of your sleep. Let the images of the high terrace, the old mason, and the iron bars fade away into a soft, indistinct blur, like a landscape being slowly covered by a heavy, silent snowfall at midnight. The snow falls on the jagged slate cliffs. It falls on the dark, quiet surface of the tea plants, and it falls on the timber roof of the hut, smoothing out all the sharp, irregular edges of the world until everything is wrapped in a single pale blanket of absolute peace. You are dissolving into that soft, white quiet, your breath becoming nothing more than a faint, rhythmic sigh that blends perfectly with the movement of the night air. The long lifting is finished. The stone has met the ground, and the foundation is completely clean, resting in the deep, undisturbed dark where no story can ever reach it again. Slide down into the dreamless depths, where is nothing left to remember, nothing left to balance, and nothing left to do but yield to the immense, healing current of your own deep rest. Beneath that deep rest lies a landscape of undisturbed stillness that has never known the weight of a name, a debt, or a failure. When you drop the heavy identity of the one whose life structure was ruined, you are not fading into a void. You are returning to the vast, original space that existed before any wall was ever imagined. We often spend our entire lives believing we are the built house, permanently defined by the cracks and fractures that time has brought to our walls. But early Zen wisdom reminds us that your true nature is more like the unyielding bedrock itself. The bedrock can hold the weight of a palace or the debris of a collapsed terrace for a season, yet when the structure is cleared away, it remains completely uncompromised, retaining its native strength without a single scar or a memory of what it carried. As you lie here in the profound dark of your room, let yourself experience the sheer luxury of being absolutely nothing to anyone for the next few hours. You do not have to be the architect who rebuilds the future. You do not have to be the reliable provider who keeps the roof from leaning. And you do not have to be the victim who demands an apology from the past. All those roles are merely heavy iron tools that you can lay down on the damp soil of the workshop, allowing your spirit to become entirely weightless, floating on the cool, calm surface of this immediate midnight. The people who misjudged your path, the events that upended your security, and the choices that fractured your plans are all miles away, frozen in a past time that has no physical reality in this immediate room. They cannot touch the living, breathing sanctuary of your current body unless you continue to rebuild their boundaries in your thoughts. When the mountain finally clears the path of every painted box and every broken sieve, who is the one that rests, deeply golden and entirely whole, within the dark limestone of the quiet world,